we know that this is Craig Owens.
Right.
Yes, thank you. And Craig reached out to me a couple of years ago to see what I knew about the Palomar Hotel. And when we were sitting in my kitchen, it became very apparent that after 2 hours of conversation, he knew a whole lot more than I did, and really researched it down to the bones.
As best as I can for now. I mean, there's still a lot of mysteries about the building, and someone will have a piece somewhere that is missing to the puzzle. I found it awful strange and peculiar that there are no photos of it when it was the Hotel McCulloch, nor are there any historical photos of the original owner, Lena M. McCulloch. I'm hoping someone somewhere has a shoebox full of old photos.
There you go.
Or because she was an interesting character, and we're going to go into her biography.
Okay, and I'm going to just interject so I can go and take a seat.
Sure.
You are welcome to purchase some of his books, Haunted by History, and they are available. Usually they're $50, but for us he's making it $40. And after the presentation, he will be at a table in the back and will also sign the books. So let's give a really warm welcome to Craig Owens.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming here. I just drove in from Los Angeles. I'm going to use my notes for this. The Palomar history that I have has not been published yet. It is slated to be published in Volume 2. Volume 1, just for the record, it covers 8 historic hotels with legends attached to them. You know what I mean? Among those are the Hotel del Coronado, the Julian Gold Rush Hotel, the Mission Inn, the Alexandria Hotel, downtown Los Angeles, which was Los Angeles' version of the Mission Inn, and the Hotel del Coronado. The Pierpont Inn in Ventura, built in 1910, the Banning House Lodge, which was a summer home built by one of the Banning brothers at the time that they owned Catalina Island. So it's located on Catalina, and then ends with the Glen Tavern Inn in Santa Paula, just outside of Ventura. I will say it took about over 7 years to research all of these hotels. Palomar was definitely a challenge because there was a lot of pieces missing. I was able to kind of try to piece together and found out that the plaque is incorrect by about 2 years on everything. And we'll get into all of that. But one of the other things I want to point out is, I don't know how many of you have been to Julian, or the Julian Gold Rush Hotel. They have a big sign out front that says established 1897. I was able to prove that it was actually built in 1902. So it missed the gold rush by 5 more years than it already did. So some of this stuff was luck, some of it was just hard work, some of it was patience. So I'm not, when I started writing this, for the record, I felt like I needed to explain what the purpose of a hotel would be in the community that it was built in. Most of you already know the history of Temecula, so I won't go into all of that. It's certainly an interesting place, and anyone that is like tuning in through Facebook and doesn't know the history of Temecula, it was the Deadwood of Southern California. It was very slow to give up its Wild West reputation. Much slower than most of the towns, including Deadwood, It was kind of this forgotten place, except for the local community that was there. It started out as Native American territory, then it became a trail for a stagecoach that came through the Southern Immigrant Trail. It was when California fell under Alta California Mexican rule, the Mexican government, the California Alta government, tried to start stripping the land away from the Native Americans. Native Americans did not like that, the local band that lived here. So when Alta California and the United States went to war, they sympathized with the United States, hoping that they would get a break. Well, they didn't. When the United States won the war. San Francisco court started stripping the land away one by one. Again, most of you already know the history, and I'm leaving out a lot of details and a lot of pain. But what put Temecula on the map actually started with a visit with Helen Hunt Jackson. What was it, 1883 that she came here? She actually stayed at the Wolf Adobe, just not very far from here. She went back, studied it, interviewed people, went back east, wrote her book, became a huge sensation. On page 1 of Ramona, Temecula is mentioned. Put Temecula on the map. Now, we all know that there were many different Temeculas before this one took off, the one that that has actually incorporated several of the old Temeculas into the city. So, tourists started to come in, people started to flow. Then the real estate crush of 1888 pretty much almost wiped this town out. What was going to be a Wild West Ramona town shrunk to about 150, 200 people. Then the Vail Ranch, the Vails moved in. They actually were going to buy land on Catalina Island first. I don't know if you knew that. They were exploring that as cattle, but the grass was too minimal. They needed bigger land. So they came out here, they liked what they saw, they bought all the land surrounding what was then the town of Temecula, and let me go ahead and move forward a little bit. That was either a second edition of Ramona I picked up, but I love the cover. It romanticized, and this is what brought people not just to Temecula, but to Southern California in general. But what most people don't realize is that Palomar, the Palomar Mountain, began to take off too. And there are many factors of that. And one of the factors, and it's kind of a forgotten factor, was that there was another book. It wasn't just Ramona that started bringing people out this way. It was a book called The Pride of the Palomar. And it too was a kind of a big selling book. And they actually made a movie out of it. This book came out around 1921, 1922, I want to say. It started bringing tourists from San Diego and from LA wanting to see it. And the roadways weren't terribly well, worked very well at the time. So the state park started building roads up that way. Then suddenly it became a very popular destination for picnickers. And Temecula was a road stop at that time for a lot of people traveling through. So Temecula was beginning to finally get out of its doldrums a little bit with the purchase of land by the Vail Ranch and the rise of the automobile that was coming through. Now, I found an article that was real interesting. The Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce had a lot to do with the improvement of paved roads, because apparently when automobiles were very new, there would be these great, it was almost like the Great Race, where all these people that had automobiles would drive all together from San Diego up to LA, but many of them didn't make it too far past Temecula because the roads were so bad. And Temecula's roadways were specified by the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce as being the worst in Southern California. So, I mean, literally, cars were just breaking down in potholes. It was all dirt roads at that time. So, compound that with this novel, technological advances, the rise of the automobile, and some money actually being put into the roadways. Temecula had a fighting chance of kind of coming back a little bit. There was as you know, there was already a very popular hotel among locals that was built in the 19th century. It still remained the most popular hotel, even after the Palomar was built. But let's talk about this Palomar a little bit, because it was a little surprising to me. I believe that in some of the interviews that I had given, there were a lot of legends about the place. And one of the legends, one of the stories is that, oh, it's the first modern hotel that Temecula ever had, because it had electricity and running water and all that good stuff. Well, it had that, but I don't think it impressed too many people at that time. Another legend that came out had to do with a alleged speakeasy or distillery that was built behind the Palomar Inn, and according to the story that was passed on by several people, it exploded, and no one knows what happened to it since then. So I took these stories and I tried to look it up, and lo and behold, I think there is some grain of truth to the story about a distillery, although there are details that are missing. So let's go back to 1915. Believe it or not, the person that owned that land was Joe Winkle's brother. And Joe Winkles was the vice king of Temecula. He ran the prostitutes. He ran the liquor, one of the saloons. He was involved in the shooting that involved Forrest McGee, that made headlines all across Southern California. He had already been arrested and fined at least a couple of times for operating a blind pig, which is another word for an illegal bar. Even though we're going back 1915, and they're saying, well, yeah, but Prohibition was 1920. Not for Riverside County, it wasn't. Riverside County, of course with the exception of the Mission Inn, was dry. The only reason why the Mission Inn was allowed to serve wine and beer was because Frank Miller owned all the politicians. And he literally wrote the laws and got them passed, or he didn't write the laws, he had his friends write the laws, where a hotel had to be a certain size in order to get around the Prohibition thing, and he made it sure that it was, his hotel was the only one that had that size. Okay? But it wasn't like that in Temecula. No, Temecula was supposed to be dry. Now there were several, I mean, at first the Temeculans were like, laws, schmaws, you know. There was even supposedly a saloon right across the street from the post office. And that was,
Long Branch.
yeah, very illegal, but they did. You know, and every now and then law enforcement would come over and whatnot. So, and do a raid, but the roadways were so bad that they didn't really like coming back there. And this was Native American backcountry. So people were like, let's not get out of the car if they drove through, usually. However, by the 20s, things were beginning to loosen up a little bit. With the, let me see where we want to start with this, as I've already given the kind of the backstory. As we know, was it the Mother Cafe opened in 1927, right? The first roadside cafe. So let's talk about the Inland Highway. That was the first major highway that was built that ran through Temecula. And it was paved, at least parts of it were paved. And this allowed visitors driving through, stop, get gas. There was the Knott station that opened it up. It used to be a blacksmith shop. Once the automobiles started coming through and the horses stopped coming through as often, one of the pioneers here decided, hey, I'm getting with technology. So he converted his blacksmith shop to a gas station. This is also pivotal to why the Palomar was built where it was. Because it was built almost right across the street from there. Just kind of across the street and down the ways a bit, right?
Right across the street.
Okay,
Basically,
right across, yeah.
Maybe 50 feet across.
I'll have a photo to show you here soon. But here's a look at Joe Winkles in his younger days. He came to Temecula in around 1902 from Los Angeles. And he started out as like a stable livery boy. But somehow or another, he started taking over property, and one of the properties he took over what belonged to the Welties. It was a store, and he turned it into the Ramona Inn, which became this place of notoriety. He was connected with the motion picture industry. I'm not sure how. Maybe it was through gambling or boxing, but it took me a long time to finally get corroboration, but in the 19 teens, he was friends with a sports writer who was good friends with Fatty Arbuckle and Buster Keaton and Hal Roach, who did the Laurel and Hardy films and the Our Gang, Little Rascals. So they did come to visit. It took me forever to figure that out and to get corroboration, but it does appear to be true. But it wasn't in the, it may have been in the 1920s, might have been in the late 1910s, but it wasn't during it was before the Palomar was built. So the legend about movie stars staying at the Palomar in its infancy, probably not true, okay? Okay, so this is Meet Joe Winkles. He also, besides Vice, he was actually a man about town. I mean, he was kind of respected. He invested in the bank building. He was one of the investors. He was kind of a social butterfly. I think the townspeople kind of liked him. There was a newspaper, what was the newspaper strip that used to reference him in Los Angeles? Was it Crazy Cat? Dale, do you remember? There was a newspaper strip that used to make a reference.
Comic strip?
Yeah, it was a comic strip in the funny pages that occasionally would make reference to Joe Winkles. So
Wow.
he was well known, and he was also well known in San Diego as well. Okay, so he owned the land in 1915, so remember that.
He
And
did or his brother did?
His brother did, but what happened is Winkles bought the lot right next to it, and then when his brother more or less sold, and they merged the property. So he actually owned a couple of lots right there, okay? So I had to go to the tax assessory office in Riverside County to try to find out what was on that ground that made him want to own it so badly, because it was out in the boondocks. I mean, it was not in Temecula proper. It was outside the town. Lo and behold, I found where he had built a very small structure on that land. And I believe it was like $10, $20. So you know it's like a shed or a barn. Okay, so here's one of the things that we learned about Winkles, is that when he did this at another place, but it wasn't a barn, it was a distillery
Oh.
for hiding and making booze. And interestingly enough, it stayed on this property until 1919, and then suddenly it's gone. And looking at the records in 1919, he was raided at the Ramona Inn and was arrested that same year. So, what happened to that distillery? Well, I know what happened to the other distillery, the other bar he had. That got raided, that made the news, and it was torn down physically by the Tri-County enforcement. I haven't been able to find any record that this was a distillery, but I find it coincidental that it just happens to disappear in the year that he gets arrested again for operating a blind pig. He continued to hold on to this land until 1927. And in late 1927, actually it was right around Thanksgiving, he sold a deed to a woman named Lena M. McCulloch. Now, Lena M. McCulloch, let me get to her, because she turned out to be a very interesting person. Now, some documents refer to her as a widow. Some documents refer to her as a divorcee. Around the time that, oh, let's go ahead and let me show you this. This was from the Riverside, and you'll see that Winkles, the entry at 1914. That is actually when they bought the parcel of land, and then the barn came up around 1915 or so, and it lasted until 1919, and then it just remained vacant. Suddenly there were no taxes for a long time. Okay, let's get to Lena McCulloch. She was actually a tough person to find initially, because She was born with a different name, and she changed her name many different times. Lena McCulloch is a forgotten figure in Temecula's history. She was born as Helena May Hall in Seattle, Washington in 1876. Her father worked as a millman, possibly a lumber company, and her mother worked odd jobs to supplement the family income. After the birth of the Hall family's second child, Oakley, in 1878, Lena's parents either divorced or they split and parted ways. So she came from a broken home. Her life was filled with scandal, and so we're going to start getting into it. Some of it's very bizarre. In 1892, Lena's mother, Mary, you're going to love this. How many are you from Elsinore? Anybody? Okay. If anyone here is from Elsinore, familiar with Elsinore, you're going to love this because there's a tie here. Let me go ahead and show you this. This was the grant deed, the first grant deed between Joe Winkle and Lena M. McCulloch, as you can see here. They actually signed a couple of them, but this is the first one. And this was in 1927. Okay, let's get to this, because I find this fascinating. The woman at the top, that's Lena McCulloch's mother. And the person down below is a guy named Captain Rufus Creswell. So let's talk about the great Creswell. In 1892, Lena's mother Mary married Captain Rufus Milton Creswell, a San Diego entrepreneur who made a living shuttling tourists to and from scenic destinations on his ferry boat at Point Loma, California. Following her mother's marriage, Lena and her brother Oakley moved to San Diego. When Lena was 16 years old, she became pregnant out of wedlock. And with her parents' written permission, she married a 26-year-old British immigrant named George Samuel Pyle. She gave birth to a daughter, Marion, in 1896, followed by a second daughter, Ruth, in 1897. But her marriage to Pyle was not a happy one, and the couple divorced in 1900. Although Lena fought for custody of both daughters by accusing her husband of willful neglect, records indicate that she lost custody of Ruth. No connection that they ever got back together. Red flag 1. She didn't get custody of one of the children. Red flag 2 is about to come up next. There are a lot of red flags. In 1911, Creswell turned his ferry boat business over to his Oakley, Lena's younger brother, who had grown up to become a ship's captain.